Welcome to another episode of The Absurdity of Nothing, hosted by me, Carlos Gomez. On today's episode, I'm going to be covering a very sensitive topic, so I would like to issue a warning, it will be listed as well in the comments and the details. It's a very sensitive topic, and I think that if you are sensitive to the subject of death and suicide, then you should skip this episode. I'm going to be covering a lot of personal, private details and stories, and they are real life scenarios, so I don't want to trigger anybody, or I don't want to give anyone any kind of trauma that they haven't signed up for. So with that said, I also want to say that if you know anyone that has any kind of mental health issues or problems, or is displaying symptoms of depression and bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and things like that, it's always a good idea to look for help and look for different methods of helping these people out, including yourself. This person happens to be you. Never be ashamed to direct anyone towards any kind of support system, any kind of professional help that can lead to different outcomes in life. Because you'd never really know. But yeah, so with that said, I'm going to start the episode. So today I want to record an episode of The Absurdity of Nothing that hits particularly home. Very strange details of a coworker that I had worked with approximately a decade ago, or even further back. Long story short, or the gist of it is, I just found out that he committed suicide and took his own life approximately 6 to 7 years ago. And I was watching the Super Bowl, watching the greatest American corporate sports entertainment product. And it just took me for a loop, took me for a spin. I wasn't expecting to hear that in all actuality. I definitely was taken aback. I spent a lot of time with this person. We'll call him Robert. Robert was a middle-aged man working the overnight shifts at a condominium in a very affluent neighborhood in New Jersey. He was a good man. He was an honest person. He was definitely someone who exhibited symptoms of psychosis and mental health issues, if you will. Speaking as someone who also exhibits a lot of symptoms and suffers from a lot of the things that people with mental health suffer from. Mental health problems, that is. Robert was a interesting person to talk to because he wasn't afraid to say what was on his mind, even if it wasn't politically correct, or he wasn't afraid to say things that other people wouldn't say out loud. In terms of being crass and being blunt, that was kind of his MO. He was French and Argentinian, but he considered himself to be more French than anything, or Italian, which is probably the most Argentinian thing you can do, because he spoke in a very, very Argentinian accent when he spoke Spanish, and he came off as very well-to-do in his English. He had a very good English Caucasian accent, if you will. I was in my late teens, and it was my first real official job, the longest job that I had held to that point. I was basically learning how to fend for myself, how to be a man. I had held smaller jobs before, but this was the most official job that I had. And he was basically one of the first work friends that I had established. Being a concierge or security guard or doorman is quite a lifestyle. It's a very particular job. Obviously, you would have to be a certain ilk to perform this job for a minimum of 40 hours a week. And that was definitely something that took its toll on someone like Robert. So around this time, I'm writing a lot. I'm also making music. I'm sorting out my psychosis, sorting out all the weak, debilitating thoughts that were in my mind at the time, which was a very lengthy process, and some might say it's a lifetime process. But I guess you can say I initiated that process at that time, or possibly a little earlier. I would write a lot of notes on my BlackBerry. At the time was the phone of the era. It was the iPhone of the era, before iPhones. And a lot of my notes, a lot of my writings were basically expressing my inner state of confusion, depression, anxiety, and overall discontent. I guess my later teenage angst. Even then, at those strange points of our lives, we managed to have moments of friendship and companionship that anchored us, at least for a few years in the scope of a lifetime.
Even at those strange points of our lives, we all managed to have moments of friendship. and companionship that anchored us, if at least a few years in the scope of a lifetime. We shared coffee and we took trains to see one another on weekends. We made time to talk to one another and we listened, even if it was at a concierge job. We made time to talk to one another, and we listened, even if it was at a job, in an extremely wealthy condominium in the middle of the night, talking about our past hiccups, our misguided attempts at love and at life, confiding in one another just to make it another day and somehow make something out of our situation in life. He was 50 and I was 19. When I started, we had nothing in common really, but we learned to work together. We trusted each other to sort of build a bond or friendship. So it hurt me to find out during the Super Bowl that he had hung himself about 6 years ago, and his brother had shot himself in the mouth before as well. I know that really affected him. He would talk about the injustices of the world that didn't make any sense. He'd read the Bible multiple times, but still, we would have many deep conversations about existentialism and the meaning of life, why we were here. He would make remarks that sometimes took me aback, but I knew he was a very blunt and opinionated person to a fault. In a place where you had to kiss ass and basically suck the teat of the millionaire class, like the Savengers, with a C, looking for the remnants of the apex predator's sustenance. That ate him up inside for some reason. Sometimes it would eat me up inside as well. He could never shake that. He hated that part of life. He would say things like, "There's always gonna be somebody else's Nigger." And he was overtly racist in a comical way. He would say things that were real and crass and laugh at the absurdity of it all for hours at a night. He cackled like a hyena. He cackled like a hyena at the absurdity of it all. He would eat beans from a can and would be a very frugal person. He was educated as an accountant, but settled as a concierge for some reason. I figured he was too honest to be an accountant. He knew that. He knew that much. From the moment I found out about him, I figured that out. I didn't really have time to make too many judgments about him because I was a rookie. I knew nothing, and I was assured that the only thing that I did know was that I knew nothing. And I took comfort in that, as that was the smartest thing I could possibly do. We had to survive, even if we all left after our shift was over. We had this companionship of we are the overnight guys, and we do what we must to make it out of here, and to do what we have to do to make the ship run and keep the machine running. It was our lifeline, and it was our meal ticket. It was shortly after the great crash of '08, so being in a place where you are constantly surrounded by the top 1% of affluence isn't for the faint of heart. You have to have a certain character and attitude to make it there for a long time. You could be the type to kiss ass and brown nose, but people could only handle so much of that until it just becomes too offensive to be around. You need to have balls, and you need to have charisma. You need a high IQ. If you don't, you won't survive too long. That's what the game was about. Be of use. serve, direct. Maybe that took something out of us. Maybe that drained us in a way we wouldn't be able to notice until it was too late. You lose a little bit of your humanity with time. There's no other way around it. But that's the price you pay to play the game. When we talked about love, we talked about failures, about the past, about the ways we tried and failed to become something. Sometimes we talked while sitting behind the desk, surrounded by marble lobbies, marble floors in the lobby, and silent elevators, confessing our lives in a building that didn't care if we existed. And somehow in that absurd environment, we found companionship. Maybe that's what saved us for a while. There's something about the fact that he read the Bible multiple times, and he constantly questioned God and all the injustices in the world, and that really perplexed him. And we laughed often. We laughed at the absurdity of everything. A loud hyena-like laugh that filled the night shift with something close. But beneath the humor there was a fracture. There was something inside of him that always... I could see it. His face would shift. His tone would change. He suddenly wasn't there at the same time. He was there and he wasn't there at the same time, is what I'm trying to say. I guess we both had moments like that, where we would just completely drown in the negativity and the darkness of it all. We would just take refuge in that for moments at a time. And I guess that's what being bipolar is about, being schizophrenic, is having those moments of just drowning, absolutely drowning in it, and just reveling in it almost. Where you just completely free fall into an abyss. I wrote a lot during that time, and I wrote something that titled Meaningless Abyss and Sun Showers. And I think it was a really good description of, it encapsulates a lot of what I felt around that time, and maybe a lot of what Robert felt as well. At the same time, I was also dealing with another person who would demonstrate symptoms of mental health issues as well. Another person who would take their own life shortly thereafter, approximately 3 to 4 years after the timeline. There was a lot more substance abuse in that one. There's a lot of different drugs being abused, alcohol, you name it. There's always the thought that it'll just go away at some point. That all the substances will just boil over and suddenly they won't mean anything anymore. They won't have the effect that they have. That they'll just find something different fuel off, something else to run off, something better. Even having children maybe wasn't even enough to continue to want to keep doing this. But who really knows where their mind went and how you get to that point. To be surrounded by it, to be in the middle of it, is always complicated, because one is always living their own life, trying to make things work for yourself, trying to secure your future, trying to build your own castle, if you will. So there's always a bit of regret or lament that maybe perhaps there was something else to be done, something you could have done to change the outcome. But in reality, that's just our egos trying to feed itself importance, try to make it seem like we could do something when in reality it had nothing to do with anything other than that person and their own thoughts and the things that they thought about consistently. And it's a really heavy feeling. Looking back and reading those notes, those stories, the writings, and I realized that they were random fragments, half poems, angry thoughts, maybe just analysis. Very guttural, expressive method of writing words to express, to journal, or to try to release something when the music wasn't enough. So there's a lot of confusion. But writing was the only way I knew how to scream quietly. So at some point I realized suicide was no longer an abstract idea or something that happened on the television set. It was no longer something that happened to other people. It was a pattern, a silence that grows unnoticed, a system that slowly drains people until they disappear. Maybe certain environments erode us, erode our humanity. When your role is to serve, obey, and be useful and smile, when something inside of you begins to die quietly. In those luxury buildings, we weren't people, we were just functions. And maybe that's the price of playing the game. You lose pieces of yourself, until one day you don't recognize what's left. Sometimes the people who keep us alive are just coworkers, strangers, night shift companions, people we never thought we would love. And sometimes the absurdity of life is not that nothing matters, but that the smallest moments mattered
Mattered more than we ever understood.
thank you for tuning into another episode of The Absurdity of Nothing.